Mr. Laskey. He currently is the senior professor in the basic education courses in the architectural school at Washington University in St. Louis. He studied at the University of Chicago, the University of Michigan, the Institute of Design, which is now a part of the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. He studied at Indiana University, where he received a master's in graphic arts. He has taught at the Institute of Design, at North Carolina State University, at Washington University now for the past 10 years. He received a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship in 1952. He has been shown in a number of exhibitions, and he says about 3 exhibitions a year. He works in a variety of media: jewelry, sculpture, painting, printmaking, graphic arts, industrial design. He says he's the architect and builder of his own summer place up in Michigan. He's currently designing a limited series of gold jewelry for the May Company. I think it will be limited to an edition of 6 items. And I've forgotten whether it was $3,000 per set or $3,000 per necklace. $3,000 per necklace. He also is doing the complete graphics setup for the new campus of Northwestern University. This is the campus that is built on landfill out in Lake Michigan. The project which is being done by Skidmore, Owings, Merrill. He says that he would prefer not to answer any questions after his talk tonight, but he did admit that he would answer one question, and I told him that you would probably have some questions, at least the sophomores here would probably have some questions to ask him about the mural that he is doing for the psychology building, the new psychology building at the University of Illinois. It's going to be 60 feet wide and 9 stories high. Made 100% out of Indiana limestone. So with that question for the end of the lecture, I'll turn it over to Les Laskey.
I always feel like one of my dogs when we put this on. They don't like it either. Charles asked me, thank you, Charles. Charles asked me to give him a title, and I whipped one up quickly, calling it Sex in the University. But I decided to change it and talk about design education now. Everybody, I think, knows what that word means. It really denotes a position. It lets us know a place. It talks about a time. I think there are very few of us, if any, who really understand what we mean by design education. I think we're finding it out all of the time. We're trying to find it out. We're trying to find out what the limits and the roles that we have to play. The painter and the sculptor, the architect, the craftsman. These areas are interchangeable for me, and I think they have to remain that way in this sort of process. This evening I thought I would talk, I'd take like some stand-up comedian, 4 or 5 or 6 bits of information expose them to you or talk about them, read them to you. And then I think we ought to weave together a kind of program or a kind of system that probably has something to do with one's attitude toward design or toward life. Certainly it has something to do with the kind of educational process. It was interesting, last week or the week before, in the London Observer, there was an article about certain kinds of American cults, and they have several organizations in Los Angeles who are teaching people how to be sensitive people. I'll read a little bit from this article. It's by Christine Doyle. Executives, doctors, congressmen, and social workers here are learning how to become the sensitive people. At behavioral institutes throughout America, groups of them may be found dredging up feelings and emotions long shielded by the educative process and conventions. The idea is to refine their genuine selves and establish the truth of how they feel and interact with each other. Solid citizens are experiencing the joy of acting out dreams, abandoning intellectual abstractions, and focusing on feelings through physical rather than verbal media. Under the guidance of uninhibited psychologists, the vogue for sensitivity classes shows no sign of declining. Thousands are booking for months ahead. Over 300 officials from the State Department have signed on the Institute for Behavioral Science in Washington. I'm not reading all of it. That same weekend, in the Post-Dispatch, was a picture article about a neurologist and psychologist who was discovering a tribe of people who seemingly, the children, were either born with a gigantic quantity of birth defects, or they were genetically a retarded race. And this neurologist is teaching them, through some research, the idea that if they would crawl and be taught to crawl, because they were not permitted as little babies or children to move around on the floor because of the danger. There were spiders and centipedes and snakes and all sorts of traps for young bodies. They were constantly under the eye and the warning voice of their parents, or their mother in particular. And so they limited their spheres of reference. They became insensitive to the stimuli of distance, emotion. They couldn't focus their eyes on anything closer than, let's say, 10 or 12 feet. They couldn't form sentences. They could not speak the language of the tribe. And this neurologist, after teaching them to crawl, also established the idea that they could learn these processes. Another doctor friend of mine tells me that this is one of the ways that they cure stroke victims who have been paralyzed. In rerouting or reconditioning the body to take on tactile and visual stimuli by having grown men and women, young and old, who've had strokes and who have been partially paralyzed, crawl on mats and in a certain given reference point. In the New Harpers, Alfred Kazin is writing about conversations between generations. My reason for talking about design education now partially comes from the fact that I think we're finding it harder and harder to get through the barriers that I think our process establishes over a period of time. I think 3/4 of the educational institutions that profess to teach the arts, and architecture is included, and 3/4 may be a generalization, no doubt, but I don't put it down, I'll be playing with it. So I think our sort of living in the 19th century and working in the 19th century and establishing 19th century foundations. I believe in historical ideas and historical development, but I do not believe that they ought to be the life's blood of a young generation. Basho, who is a Japanese poet, cites my position, I think, fairly well. He says, "Do not copy the ancients, but seek what they sought." It's a haiku. And he talks in terms of, really proving one's existence by your own ideals now, not from yesterday's roots. Kazin talks about the way art changes, and he also says that it never improves. It may go down or up, but it never improves like technology or medicine. All of the wisdoms we have collected about art have never helped the ungifted man to create. I suspect the comments I might have made just previous to this have something to do with that statement. The idea that if we stay in a school long enough, we may be better creators or we might be better inventors. I don't think it's possible. I read somewhere that science is a way of making the ordinary man intelligent. You can not say of art what you can say of science, that it does grow on itself, that it creates a body of knowledge from which the individual can learn creativity. Art changes only when remarkable persons with a new technological language, that is a new human instinct, enter the picture. Now, of course, I'm taking a lot of these things out of context to perhaps prove something. But the thing that I would like to do is to try and switch you into a kind of stream that I think the arts or the crafts needs in order to live. On the same week, Nigel Gosling, who is an art critic for the Observer, writes, and I applied this to myself this evening, "A painter who can be trusted with a microphone or a typewriter is rare. When asked to theorize, he tends to wobble between technical code, language, and cosmic bubble blowing. But get him to talk about a concrete picture and he is almost always riveting. This is natural, for any work of art has two aspects. There is the inner face which arises from some unconscious source, and an outer one which is its physical manifestation. By their nature, the basic inner feature cannot be revealed except through the artist's own medium. But the activity bound up with this revelation can lead to discussion on another level which can be enormously interesting and useful. It is here that art connects with craft, that an experience becomes an experiment, and that a deeply felt awareness is translated into a problem, the solving of which becomes the artist's total obsession. Out of these 5 things, or 4, and another one I'm going to add now, Barbara Jones, who is an author, an English authoress, and she collects information about all sorts of queer things. She's done a book, a few years ago called The Unsophisticated Arts, in which she covers taxidermy and tatting and Silesian cart decoration and houseboat decoration and all sorts of, things that we sort of laugh at. But she made a rather interesting comment that only the very illiterate people and only the very simple-minded people can learn very involved or memorize, not learn, I take that word back, memorize very involved tatting or crocheting patterns. And I suspect our education or design education or art education, if you will, tends to make very elaborate patterns for us to work in or for us to live in. And it doesn't say very much for the kind of society in which we live. These 5 or 6 bits of information or reportage, I think we ought to try and connect or relate together. Design education may be the fruit or certainly the position of the designer or the design educator. And I think it has to become more and more clarified. What are these roles that we're really talking about? We must play as a sort of design teacher. Are we to be tastemakers, imparters of static information, rule makers, lawmakers? Where do these sort of medieval concepts start or precepts stop? How willing are we always to sort of give a new position to our eyes and to our life? Even though it may obscure temporarily, something that you believe in or an established pattern. Do we teach or do we allow learning to become an easy activity and not just and have it an accepted process and not an exception? I believe that there are things that we are taught, but they are less valuable than the things that we learn. As Charles was telling you about some of the background, I trained as an architect at the Institute of Design. I went from there into visual design and into exhibition design. And from there, I suppose I started teaching sculpture by some queer fluke. I was helping my sculpture teacher carry some rather large cabinets up the stairs, and I swear I had nothing to do with the accident that followed. But he fell, and a large cabinet fell on his back, and he hurt his spine, and he called me to the hospital the next day and said, "You're going to take over the class." And I never wanted to be a teacher, but I haven't stopped teaching since. I do not have a degree in biology or botany, and I breed my own begonias and my own lilies and a couple of other plants I'm experimenting with. I know a great number of things about botany, and I do lecture as a guest in our botany department at Washington U. These are some of the things that I have learned. I was trained as a sculptor and a silversmith, and only recently have I started to take up that role. I feel now it's sort of the time. Now is the time. Because I can see what I want to do in the material that I'm interested in. Architecture, of course, is, as Mr. Dean Saffenfield will tell you, is probably a self-expression medium for me, since I'm not registered. But it's an involvement that I have that I suspect comes out in the things that you see up on the wall. I'm talking about learning. And I think that half of the things that you have in school ought to be something that you learn, not something necessarily that you've been taught. I think that the kind of viable life, and that's probably a redundancy, but if you are to live as broadly or as strongly as I think you ought to live, with passion and with a great deal of feeling, you have to have learning take a dominant role. And this means taking the teaching that you get and expanding it and extending it. Nobody can teach you to be an architect, I don't believe, or a painter. I think it takes something more than just the 5 years that you're here. Education of any kind must involve experience, tactile, sensual, expressive, love, direction. I think it must have information, historical perhaps, research, exploration. These areas allow for no conclusion. They allow only for development. They begin with God knows what, like with some of the things that we've been talking about. How do you connect Kazan's comment about art not improving with a man who is teaching people to be sensitive? How do you relate the children who are crawling and learning to, use their brains that have obviously been retarded, and relate it to Barbara Jones's information about, illiterate people memorizing crocheting patterns? What do you say about Gosling's idea about the interaction of craft, or the levels that communication has with a painting or a sculpture, or with architecture, if you will? How do you tie these things in one bag? Driving down here, and I suppose tonight will be, I was going to have a batch of sugar cubes for you, but I decided against it. Driving down here, I noticed that at one gas station you can get Walt Disney's Happiest Hits for $1 and 10 gallons of gas, And I really thought about the Beatles, and the Mothers. If you, the Beatles are refusing to make public performances now because they're too involved with the kind of Eastern religion, number one, but they can't get the kinds of effects, the kind of, relationships that they get on a recording. The recording mechanism is much more flexible. They can introduce different kinds of instruments and retape whole sequences. And they can't do this except in a very clumsy way. And until they reach this point, they're not going to sell their medium to you as a kind of personal identity. That you are not going to see them make asses of themselves. They want to do it in a very sort of concrete way. I think this has something to do with, you might call it McLunacy, If you take Marshall McLuhan's idea about medium, they understand what their message is all about. And they're only giving it to you in a very cool way. And that's the way it has to be. The Mothers, that's a different story. The Mothers of Invention is the freakiest collection of people. McLuhan, again, and I suppose what I'm doing is sort of dipping into McLuhan, really bites at our throats. I crossed out thighs, I don't know why, but I have throats here. To remind us of our vulnerability and our sort of jaded appetites. I think that, the kinds of things that we have responded to for so long, flicking through Life magazine, the kind of sickness that you get in Life or Look or Time, where 8 million things are being bombarded at you. How do you sort this information out? It's like the collection I gave you now. Where does it end? Where does it begin? How do you even start to relate this to your life here as a designer? It was curious, when I came in, somebody asked me to talk about a painting. Unfortunately, I felt I was getting a little hostile. And I don't know why. I think that what my 5 fragments of, reportage or newspaper clippings have to do with your life are the same thing that these things have to do with me. They're parts of my skin, I suppose, parts of my heart, parts of my eyes. They tell you the way that I begin to feel out a form or a group of stimuli. They take a very sort of moving experience I was talking with Mr. Maddox before, and one of the strongest visual things I have that haunts me for God knows, and I don't know why, was the Apollo fire. I was traveling in Europe, and suddenly I heard that we had lost 3 astronauts. It really clouded most of the rest of my trip. And I had to come home, and I wanted to paint, and I wanted to sculpt, and I wanted to write. It's like the French have a saying that it says, if you can't write a poem to explain your feelings, dance it, you know. And I wanted to do something. So the results of some of these things have to do with that fire. The kind of emptiness that I suppose it's like John Kennedy, and I suppose we should have flags, but I don't think that I'm afraid of, showing you that I can cry on occasion. And I suspect that great numbers of us are. The kind of vulnerability we all have to this kind of destruction was really sort of elaborated or multiplied in that fire. It doesn't take a very, strong mechanical object to destroy 3 lives, or a strong idea. And I suppose that's all of the things that we talk about. I suppose that's the extent of my social protest, if you will. I think we need an area as a kind of clearinghouse. I believe that we ought to have a place in which we can be human. This sensitive people's school probably is teaching something, is having to unteach a great number of things. The way that people memorize certain ideas. Why do they have to do that? In order to be comfortable, in order to be unchallenged, so no one will ask questions. Questions perhaps that can't be answered. Do you insulate yourself as these people might do? How far do you stretch your learning process, or do you put barriers up? How really strongly we need the kind of tactile learning and the sensuosity of our contact with the earth, with other people. Certainly rebuilding or rechanneling a great number of, responses. Is that what the school ought to be for, or a school ought to be for? I feel like at high school people, I run the first 2 years, and at Washington U, architecture school. And we spend a great deal of time unteaching, but I don't suppose it's unteaching as much as it is prodding barriers or walls that have been established through sort of family, pressures, economic ones, social ones. And half of our semester or half of our time is spent in this kind of, exchange. The 2 levels on which we operate as creative people, the kind of informative one in which one speaks directly about material, about, application, process, if you will, facture, and then the very, very philosophical one, or the second one, which is philosophical or spiritual, and, allowing people to respond or cry or hate or kill. Use 4-letter words if you want. These are the things that I think we have to start building into our process. So you can act as a natural man or woman, man, human, I suppose, man in the hippie sense. It's interesting that this whole hippie movement comes out, and it's a kind of now process. You don't put it off. Get away. Open the door. and let it move. If you don't, somebody else is going to close it up. And I suppose what one wants is a kind of escape, or a kind of way to get out, not just escape. The parallel between, I suppose, what happens in our segregation areas, or the life of our Negro, and the hippies is a very strange one. The sort of height, the California street, Ashbury, and the sort of riotous summer we've had, I think draw blood from each other. I think they both do things in the same way. They have to do with pain, they have to do with an exploration of sensation. One needing it, the other one probably having to receive it. You sort them out by yourself. I can't get away from this thing. I can move. I remember Bucky Fuller, who used to lecture at North Carolina for 4.5 hours. I'm not going to do that to you, by the way. And he would sit, and there would be these tremendous long pauses in which Bucky would dial his next IBM card in, and then he would start, and he would stop him in another 2 hours, and something else was going on. I don't want to end my sort of conversation with you by collecting any more than I already have previously, just shortly before now. I don't want to tie it up. I don't want to put it in a bag for you. I'd like you to think in a kind of open-ended way. I feel education, and particularly design education, is like I'm really sort of turned on by, viaducts and sewers at this moment that go under roads, because I think essentially they are probably the germinal idea for primary sculpture. This is this new sort of simple block fad that we're getting with sculpture. Big forms, geometric, some penetrations, some perforations, gigantic scale. And I rather suspect that the primary sculptors, ought to start looking sort of underground at this moment. You can see the way they have guided water. They have flashings, so the water will go through this sort of sewer pipe or tile. They have beautiful connections, beautiful primary shapes, elegantly designed, and nobody looks at them except me. I get out of my car and crawl down in the gullies and watch these muddy holes. But I suspect that they will become another kind of find. I'm as turned on by, Indiana farms as I've always been. These things that sort of little islands sort of perched on the horizon. Michigan, I live in Michigan part of the summer, most every summer. And we have the same thing, and I think that they really start being the kind of germinal idea for perhaps a kind of planning. Here is really a sort of microcosm of planning. Here the farmer knows where the hell the water runs and how it runs, and where not to put his manure pile, and where to put a path to go into the barn so it doesn't blow into the house. And he does this in a very knowing way. And I suspect our planners or our urban people ought to sort of look, as I'm asking you to look or to listen, and, withdraw very quietly like the bee as he leaves the flower. I think that you've got to hook these things as best you can and find out how these connections can be made. I think you can do it with almost any group of information. You'll find that suddenly, out of a whole week, you'll be able to get a thread that hooks the New Yorker and an article by Harold Rosenberg that's just in the New Yorker about environments and architecture. You will get that, as well as perhaps the thing about the sensitive corpse and all of the other things. I'll stay here. Don't fret. I brought some slides just in case you came out and you found that it really wasn't worth very much. But in relation to my drawings here, these slides go back probably 3 to 4 years. I haven't seen them for a long time. I suspect the first thing that you will see is my own MGM lion, and whose name is Sumi. And he's quiet, but he's a Tibetan dog. You'll see the counterpart to him as a sort of last slide. I'm showing you collage and painting. There'll be some drawing. Just keep going through. They start by studying, structure and systems. Some of them are landscapes. Some of them have to do with, form and shape, the kind of interplay of line and area. For the longest time, I worked in only primary shapes to try and establish a kind of position, and then I discovered that you could add a line, and I nearly lost my mind. These started from a series of tapestries I saw hanging in the old Stav churches in Norway, and the flags were in tatters, and this is pretty much the way I feel. Some of them are lousy. Could you focus it? I don't think it's focused, is it? That's much better. Thank you. These were from a kind of Italian sojourn that I had, and they are journeys from no place, which is not a pun on a Japanese trip. You can focus that. I know they'll pop back in, but they have a slide projector now that does that tests the temperature of that plate, and then it pops the slide in focus. They're out of their minds. This is from a Greek and Roman series. The other one that was, sort of woman with her hand in her head was another. I went through an Afghan period. This is a junkyard. This is a burlap that's been immersed in asphalt. They ought not to, I don't care, probably 100 years I suppose I'd worry, but it was a medium that I think will last probably longer than our Earth, at least at the rate we're going. Unfortunately, these slides there is a lot of silver leaf in some of these areas that are picking up, which happens to be picking up reflected light and things. So you don't really get the kind of glitter we're talking. That's a fragment of one painting you'll see later on. That's quite large. It's on my dune. I sneaked in photographs of my house, by the way, which is sort of, it's generated from a Stav church and probably a Japanese temple. So you meld Norwegian architecture with Japanese temple architecture, and you may get my volume. That's my lighthouse and the Lake Michigan and my dune. Focus that, please. I got terribly curious when I was excavating for the A-frame I put up, because I was cutting through layer after layer after layer of fern root structure. And it was a graphic enough image, so I tried to translate that kind of, sense or ordering in the painting. That's Orfeo, who has been made a cuckold by death, and his wife. Some of these are repeats. It's all right. You can go faster. I think you can start seeing the leaf. Of all the painters in the world I'm fascinated with, it's a man, an Englishman, who's a contemporary of William Blake. His name is Samuel Palmer. And if I covet anything in the world, it's a couple of things in the Victoria and Albert Museum that happen to be done by Palmer. I don't think they should belong to me. I'm glad they belong to some place that allows millions of people to see it. But if you ever have a chance, I've gone 1,000 miles to see a Palmer drawing that I knew existed. There are about 12 of them in the United States at this moment. That really should be with the big glob, the big circle on the bottom. It's a kind of phoenix. And as I suppose every architect or every designer, collect structures that people consider. I don't call them chairs. In my period of, I suppose antique collecting, I've located a Chippendale chair that I bought for $1.25. This is an English chair, and I don't know any more about it than that. 20 of them were made. The man is probably as good a craftsman as ever existed. It's middle 18th century. Just, the people are just turning on to a kind of, over decoration. Beautiful system of legs and arms. You can go ahead. Come on, don't stop for me. There it is in sort of profile. And it's like a deer almost. I've found 2 of these, which are Tournette chairs, and there's the courtyard of my house. The large building is a 30 by 30 by 38 foot space. and it's uninterrupted. It has 4 columns in the center that open up or show you a light well. And eventually I will make a sort of kitchen connection or a kitchen building to enclose the court. All of these slides I put in backwards because I'm stupid. It's related to my A-frame by a kind of, just a path, and eventually I'll put another structure instead of the A-frame, because the two of them just don't work. But I need to have a place to live while I'm fixing this up. My summer was spent, if you'll notice, if you come in contact with me during the week, cleaning and carrying 6,000 brick, digging them up from a paving place and carting them up my sand dune. So I've got calluses where calluses ought to be on a brick man's hands. The light well that's up above just pours down light into the thing, and from the top, which will be a library sort of shell, I can see the lake and see other dunes and a particular venerable pine that belongs to me and I suppose the world. I don't think anybody should own a tree, do you? No. After I had locked and plugged up all of these stupid windows, I suddenly realized I hadn't taken photographs. And I wanted to be able to, show somebody that I had done something this summer. So there is brick paving in the front court. And my shoes. And my 2 dogs and I bid you good night. Thank you. What in the hell kind of question could you ask me?
One question.
Yes. About the mural? I hear that you know who Robert Ingalls happens to be, who's the head of the Limestone Institute. I went down to Bedford, and your place is so clean, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here. Not because it's clean only, but it's very nice to work in a clean plant. I went down to Bedford to look and see. I had sort of made up my mind about limestone, and I knew its qualities, I thought. And I went down to Bedford and talked to Ingalls, because the Ingalls Stone Company is doing the job. And we had quite a nice couple of days, and he showed me the plant where they process the limestone and my mural, and I'm sorry, I could have brought you some preliminary drawings of it. I probably could show it to you sometime on the blackboard, but I'm using the pyrite crystal formation that forms on the top of limestone, which gets right beneath the earth that you have to dig off in order to get into the limestone. And it goes down, it's sort of brown and crystalline, and the water soaks in, and it makes many, many different kinds of textures and colors and formations. It's all crystalline. I'm using that as a kind of coloration, because with limestone you get very subtle changes of temperature or color or texture, and I needed more contrast aside from the cuts that I'm going to put in. So I found, as she was guiding me through the Ingalls Stone Company, a fantastic garden of this stuff, and they were scrapping it all. And I said, look, this is what I want to use, And he said, well, nobody's ever done that before. And so I said, well, I think I'd like to see if we could try. And they cut it off, and it's a waste material. But I've got an idea that it's going to be, quite valuable from now on, because it can be cut just like limestone, and I'm fabricating the mural, if this is your question. I'm fabricating the mural out of pieces that are, I suppose crane and man handable. So you can put it up with a crane or put it up with a man. No piece will be any larger than probably 4 by 13 foot and probably 6 inches thick. That's about one of the largest. There are some blocks, but they go down low. And I've designed it so one would see the larger and more textural pieces and get in contact with them. There'll be 1 foot block cubes that are sort of stuck into a kind of receptacle. There are long, would you bring that thing over, and then I can, I'll show you a quick sketch. I don't think I remember it, but I'll try. At this moment, we're having a little difficulty with, I suppose you might call it the beauty board. The campus planner is afraid that perhaps we're going to upset the students' psyches by, he thinks there are lots of phallic and sexual shapes in my mural, and I did not intend this as such, but I guess you can find it where you want it, I learned a great number of things from Louis Kahn, where instead of, really putting a big lumpy ornament up way at the top, I almost just incised it, because the only place, this is in the inside of the court, and the mural goes here, and there are office windows. That makes sense. There are office windows facing at many different levels. And so I wanted to be able to give at least a little fragment for everybody. But we had $15,000 for the whole wall. That's including my salary. And so I'm giving them the mural. This is what I'm doing with the limestone foundation. There was almost midway, a bar that perhaps all seemingly cut through the building. It was probably at the 4.5 foot level, 4.5 story level. And it has a rather large, and here's a secret place. I'm just trying to give you some idea about, and here's where these blocks are going to be, that will project and get sort of connected by epoxy and, some kinds of pins. So we have a vast space that talks in terms of the kind of negative space of surface. It will be broken up in panels, like one has to sheathe a limestone wall, and perhaps they will be slightly tinted, or a blue limestone, or one of these simple, pure, almost pure white, and then there's this sort of soft, sandy buff. And here also will be built with much contrast, through cutting that kind of surface. This will be made out of this pilot surface stuff, and these are going to be built in order to get direction. And there's something in here that I can't fit in, but so forget it. And we go through a glass wall with the lines. I thought that was an awful idea, but you give a little and you take a little. That's about it. I found that place probably one of the most exciting visual experiences I've had in a long time. You see all this junk, and you see all the kind of old carving that goes on, and plaster models from the old sculptures, the old cabins that used to be there. And then you see the sort of moffat wall for a Bloomington building, and then you look at it. I was really being switched on every minute, and he was saying, well, that's just scrap, or that's just the way it saws, or this is the way something else. And I said, but no, that's what we need. But he'll take a little education, but I'm not easy.
Thank you, Les. I have to admit that I've forgotten who our guest lecturer is for next Monday night. I believe that it is as well as I remember, it's a discussion with slides of the Carpenter Visual Arts Center at Harvard, done by Le Corbusier. Please come.